the opposing sides prepared to make the territory of Kansas a battleground. 3 days after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, Senator William H. Seward of New York boldly challenged the South. Quote, "Come on then, gentlemen of the slave states. Since there is no escaping your challenge, I accept it on behalf of the cause of freedom. We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers, as it is in right." Organizations in the North geared up to send armed settlers into Kansas to claim it for free labor, while similar organizations in the South sponsored settlers who would support the slave system. In 1856, an election was held to organize the government of the Kansas Territory, but more than just Kansas settlers were involved. Thousands of pro-slavery Missouri residents, egged on by Senator David Rice Atchison, invaded Kansas. Atchison boasted that, quote, "There are 1,100 coming over from Platte County to vote, and if that ain't enough, we can send 5,000, enough to kill every goddamn abolitionist in the territory," unquote. Not surprisingly, then, pro-slavery candidates swept the elections. When the first territorial legislature met, it quickly enacted laws prohibiting anyone who expressed anti-slavery views from holding office or serving on juries. Assisting a runaway slave now carried a death penalty. President Pierce, a Northern Democrat, endorsed the work of the fraudulently elected pro-slavery legislature, but the Free State men in Kansas did not. They elected their own legislature, which promptly banned both slaves and free blacks from the territory and applied for admission as a free state. This effort to make Kansas a free state, the Topeka Constitution, was approved by the U.S. House of Representatives, but narrowly rejected by the Senate. With two rival governments, Kansas verged on the brink of its own little civil war. Fighting broke out in May of 1856. Under banners inscribed Southern Rights and South Carolina, a mob of several hundred pro-slavery men entered the town of Lawrence, the center of the Free State settlement. They wrecked the offices of anti-slavery newspapers and burned the Free State Hotel to the ground. Reports of the raid inflamed Northern opinion, with the press reporting that the town's inhabitants had been massacred, although this was not true. In response, John Brown, an ardent abolitionist, led a posse of men who massacred 5 allegedly pro-slavery settlers along the Pottawatomie Creek. The growing cycle of violence fueled outrage on both sides. The violence in Kansas spilled over into the national scene in May 1856. In that month, the senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, delivered a scathing speech entitled, quote, "The Crime Against Kansas." He damned the administration, the South, and pro-slavery Kansans. He also issued a scalding attack on one of the senators from South Carolina, Andrew Butler. Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina and a nephew of Butler, took exception to these remarks and decided to chastise Sumner in person. On May 22nd, he walked into the Senate chamber and, finding Sumner seated at his desk, began to beat him over the head with his walking stick until he lay bleeding and unconscious on the floor. Brooks resigned his seat in Congress, but his constituents were so thrilled with his thrashing of Sumner that they immediately re-elected him. To the South, he was a hero. To the North, a brutal villain who epitomized the extremes to which the South would go to force the slave system upon the country. The growing conflict over slavery shattered the national political system. Both parties had desperately tried to avoid discussing this issue, but it became unavoidable. The Democratic Party was increasingly divided between Northerners and Southerners. It retained supporters in both sections, but its popular base clearly was shifting to the South. The Whig Party, on the other hand, simply ceased to exist, unable to find a way to reconcile its Northern and Southern wings. Many Americans, particularly in the North, were now politically adrift, with no strong party ties. A number of parties emerged to appeal to them, but 2 became particularly important. The first styled itself the American Party, known to their rivals as the Know-Nothings. Their focus was not on the issue of slavery, but instead the tidal wave of immigrants that entered the country from 1845 to 1855. Many native-born Protestants were aghast at the arrival of so many German and Irish Catholics, and mobilized to take political action. Members of the American Party swore to never support any foreign-born or Roman Catholic candidate. Not surprisingly, this hostility led many immigrants to support the Democratic Party, which demonstrated a more tolerant attitude towards immigration. This influx of northern immigrant voters was a key reason the Democrats remained a successful national party in the 1850s, and why they were able to dominate national politics at this time. While the American Party enjoyed a brief season of success, it was the newly created Republican Party which provided a true alternative to the Democrats. The new party adopted many of the same basic principles as the old Whig Party. They supported a strong central government that would take vigorous action to promote economic development through mechanisms such as protective tariffs and federal support for transportation projects. They differed from Whigs in their willingness to address the issue of slavery by firmly stating their opposition to any expansion of this system into the territories. They drew upon the growing sentiment in the North that the Southern slaveocracy was trying to subvert the Constitution and deny the basic liberties of free white men under a free labor system which valued hard work and the dignity of labor. They were also different from the Whigs in that they had no Southern wing. They were an exclusively Northern party which attracted an assortment of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. The emergence of this purely sectional party fueled the crisis of the 1850s. The new Republican Party had no need to conciliate or moderate its views on slavery to appeal to Southern members, simply because it had no Southern members. To the contrary, the more they attacked what they called the slave power, the better they did in the polls. The question of the expansion of slavery into the territories thus became an unavoidable national issue, an issue that would ultimately tear the country apart. The 1857 Dred Scott case focused clearly on the issue of the status of slavery in the territories. Scott was a slave who had been taken by his master into the free Wisconsin Territory. When his master died, Scott sued for his freedom, based upon his previous residence in a territory which barred slavery under the terms of the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The United States Supreme Court, dominated by Southerners, decisively rejected his claim. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice Roger Taney argued that at the time the Constitution of the United States had been adopted, blacks had, quote, for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit, unquote. Based upon this, he asserted that even free blacks were not citizens of the United States, quote, within the meaning of the Constitution, unquote, and thus were not entitled to the rights and privileges of a citizen. In other words, they could not even bring a case before the court. Taney could have stopped there by simply denying Scott's right to bring a case before the court, but he went on to reach even more startling conclusions. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution states that citizens may not be deprived of their property without due process of law. Taney argued that because of this, the federal government had no power to stop slave owners from taking their property, that is, slaves, into any territory of the United States. He further argued that the federal government could not delegate power which it itself did not have to territorial governments. In other words, under this interpretation of the Fifth Amendment, neither the national nor the territorial governments had any power to bar slavery from a territory. The spread of slavery could not be stopped by government action. This ruling was greeted with outrage in the North, and seen as yet another example of how the Southern slaveocracy was perverting the institutions of government to serve its own interests.